Hello, my name is Nigel Bowden. I'd like to welcome you to episode 14 of the Wi-Fi for Beginners podcast. This is a series of podcasts discussing the fundamentals of wireless LAN networking, and in each episode we'll take a look at a different aspect of Wi-Fi to build your understanding and knowledge of wireless LAN networks. Each episode is accompanied by a set of slides describing the topics covered in that episode. Although you don't need to review the slides whilst listening to the podcast, they might be useful for reviewing the material we discuss and might provide some useful visual aids to help you more fully understand some of the concepts and equipment described in the podcast. All recordings and supporting material can be found at wififorbeginners.com. Okay then, so in this episode we're going to continue our discussion around wireless LAN clients. If you didn't hear the last episode, which is episode number 13, you might want to go back and review that one before continuing with this episode. As I say, the podcast series is actually broken down into a number of modules covering major topics, and we're in module number 5. Module number 5 started at episode 13, and this being episode number 14, we're continuing with our discussion around the topics in module 5, which is all around wireless LAN clients. Okay, so just a very quick review of what we covered in the last episode, just to refresh your memory before we dive into some new material. We talked about the fact that the reason that we have wireless LANs at all is to provide connectivity for wireless LAN clients. They're the whole reason that we have a wireless LAN at all. They allow users to connect to various services that they need to access. We also talked about the similarities between a wireless access point and a client. They both have one or two radios in them, and they need one or more antennas as well. Obviously, a wireless access point is a dedicated device for processing the requirements of lots and lots of wireless clients, so it's got far more functionality and a lot more hardware capability, but at a basic RF level they've both got radios and antennas, so they can form their RF connections between them. We also asked the question, what is a wireless client? And in the strictest sense, it's a wireless device that supports the 802.11 standard, very much like a wireless access point, but a wireless client actually has the capability to associate with a wireless access point. It can actually form an RF connection and join a wireless LAN network, and we discussed examples of this. It includes things like laptops, tablets, smartphones, things like that. And we also talked about the fact that ideally we like clients to associate with an access point, and as they move around the facility we like them to roam from access point to access point. We talked very briefly as well about the client connectivity process, how it actually joins a wireless LAN network. A wireless LAN client will be powered on, or it will come within range of a wireless network. It'll then perform probing to discover the wireless networks that are available, and then hopefully it'll be able to go ahead and join the network through a process called association. And then hopefully as the device moves around the network, it'll reassociate with new wireless access points as it comes in range of those access points to ensure that it can maintain its highest speed and best quality connection. We put quite a bit of emphasis on this notion of roaming to make sure that our client maintains its best quality connection, and we discussed why we're interested in maintaining this good quality connection as far as we possibly can. It's not just a question of maintaining a high speed connection for the access point, that obviously that's very desirable, but what we find is there's an effect whereby as a wireless client moves further and further away from its access point, the received signal level that it can actually receive from the access point reduces, and as the received signal level reduces, then the connection speed, which can be maintained as well, reduces, which reduces the throughput of the client. But because the wireless access point cell is a shared medium, or wireless clients are contending for access to the RF medium, if we get any clients which run at slower speeds, they're going to take longer to transfer their data, and so this has an impact on all other clients within the cell. As a client becomes slower and slower, it takes longer and longer to transmit its data, so this means other clients have to wait longer before they have the opportunity to transmit their data, and so this reduces the overall throughput of the cell, which is obviously not a desirable effect when we're trying to provide high speed, high performing wireless LAN networks. And then finally we took a very quick look on factors which will affect the capabilities of a wireless LAN client, and certainly the age of a client will have an impact. It will be determined by the various A2211 amendments that the device can support, and factors such as the physical size and the power source of the device. So it's time for us to dive into some new material about wireless clients, and we're starting off at slide number 16 if you're following along with the slide deck. It's titled Standards Review, and this is actually a misnomer. We're not actually talking about standards. We're actually talking about 802.11 amendments. If you remember, 802.11 is the IEEE standard, the main standard that we're talking about, but there are a series of amendments. As the standard evolves over time, amendments are added, and it's actually these amendments that people are generally referring to when they talk about standard support for a client device. So just talking about the 802.11 standard, as I say, it is a collection of amendments, and in fact these amendments are actually added incrementally over time, and then periodically they're actually consolidated into one overall master standard, and there may even be some amendments which are deprecated and removed from the standard. And just to give you a few examples of this, in 1997 the amendments were all consolidated into one master release of the 802.11 standard, which is 802.11-1997. The same thing happened in 2007. We had 802.11-2007, and the most recent standard consolidation was in 2012, which was 802.11-2012, surprisingly enough. And I believe there is imminently going to be a new release of the master standard, but it hasn't been released as yet. Maybe we'll see that in 2016. One thing to bear in mind when people are talking about the capabilities of a client with reference to the 802.11 amendments, they're generally talking about a specific PHY amendment, and PHY, spelled PHY, is talking about the physical layer amendments, and these are typically used to describe things like the connection speed and the band that the PHY amendment actually refers to. So if we look at one of the earliest and most popular PHY amendments, this is 802.11b. This came out in 1999, and this allowed connection speeds of up to 11 megabits per second, and this was limited to just the 2.4 gigahertz band. This one became very, very popular for a large number of devices, mainly due to the lower cost of the components for the 2.4 gigahertz band, and also the fact that the coverage provided by 2.4 gigahertz was a lot higher than for the 5 gigahertz band. And in the early days of Wi-Fi networks, coverage was very much king, and it was all about gaining the maximum amount of coverage with an access point for a wireless LAN network. Around about the same time as the 802.11b amendment came out, we had the 802.11a amendment. This was brought out in 1999 and provided connection speeds up to 54 megabits per second. So this was actually higher than the 802.11b amendment, but this one was limited to the 5 gigahertz band only. And because of the higher cost of the components for 5 gigahertz and the shorter coverage ranges, this one never really caught on in the early days of wireless LAN networks. Following on from that, in 2003 we had the 802.11g amendment. This was pretty much an upgrade to 802.11b because it operated on the 2.4 gigahertz band again, and it provided connection speeds now of up to 54 megabits per second. So it sort of brought it into line with the 802.11a standard on 5 gigahertz, but now it could be used on 2.4 gigahertz. And again, this was very, very popular because of the lower cost of components and the extra coverage which people got for wireless LANs on the 2.4 gigahertz network. The next major amendment was the 802.11n amendment, which came out in 2009, and this was a real big upgrade to the capabilities of wireless LAN networks. It provided connection speeds up to 450 megabits per second, so it was quite a jump from the 54 megabits we'd already got on the 5 and 2.4 gigahertz bands with 11a and 11g. So it gave a massive boost in capability of connection speed, which really started to challenge the notion of being connected to switched networks, because we could get much higher throughput connection speeds for wireless clients now. And theoretically the standard actually defined connection speeds up to 600 megabits per second, but manufacturers never actually moved into this territory of providing 600 megabits per second. The next standard we're going to talk about came along before anybody ever really moved into that area. 802.11n was actually unique compared to the previous 802.11 amendments in that it covered dual bands. It was actually defined to operate on both the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz band, which is the first time that a PHY amendment had actually moved into supporting both bands. Then in 2013 we had the A2211 AC amendment, and this one moved back to being defined purely for one band, and A2211 AC is only defined for operation on the 5 GHz band, which is a bit of a departure from the standard that was set in A2211M, with both bands being supported. So if you're buying any devices which support A2211 AC, remember they are going to operate on the 5 GHz band, which is a good thing these days. We really want to leverage the 5 GHz band, as we've already previously discussed. And 11AC also stepped up connection speeds massively again. The first wave of 11AC equipment was billed as supporting speeds up to 1.3 gigabits per second, again, which is quite a step up from 450 megabits that was commonly used with the 11N standard. The standard itself actually supports multi-gigabit speeds, and as newer equipment is made available, there's no doubt that connection speeds will push well past the 1.3 gigabits limit of the initial Wave 1 equipment which was produced. One important point to note about A2211AC clients: I said earlier that they operate on the 5 GHz band, and this is true. They will only operate at A2211AC speeds on the 5 GHz band. However, you'll find that many clients also have a 2.4 GHz radio as well, which they can use, but they will only generally run this using the A2211N standard. They certainly won't support A2211AC speeds on 2.4 GHz. One thing that's worth noting about all of the connection speeds that we've been talking about up to now, we've talked about 54 megabits per second, 450 megabits per second, 1.3 gigabits per second. These are purely the physical connection speed of the RF link between a client and the access point. We need to remember that the actual throughput of the link between the two devices is actually going to be a lot lower than that. If you remember, we've got the half duplex nature of wireless LANs, which is obviously going to cut the speed pretty much in half in many instances. And of course we've got the contended nature of a wireless LAN network. This means that if we've got multiple clients who are all contending to use the same wireless access point, they have to actually share the available airtime between them, and this means that if we've got multiple clients which could all theoretically run at 1.3 gigabits per second, if they have to take it in turns to use the RF medium, then their actual throughput will be a fraction of the possible 1.3 gigabits per second. So a published connection speed is not the actual throughput speed that you will achieve from a wireless client, and it's well worth remembering this when you're looking at things like capacity and performance of a wireless LAN network. So now we're just going to take a little bit of walkthrough of the evolution of wireless LAN clients. I think it's quite interesting to have a historical context on how we arrived at where we are now with the proliferation and types of wireless clients that we've got, and also some of the legacy clients that we still need to actually support. So back in the early days of Wi-Fi networks, wireless clients were very much a subset of all devices which connected to a network. The vast majority of client devices were wired, so devices such as PCs, laptops, printers, they were all permanently wired into a switched port. And wireless devices were pretty specialist niche type devices, very popular in places like warehouses where you had handheld scanners, which gave you the convenience of being so mobile, very easy to use. Obviously a wired connection doesn't really work in that environment when you've got people moving around a warehouse. We had things like voice over IP phones. They were particularly popular in hospitals, and we had a number of laptops as well. They were used quite a bit in the enterprise space, but initially this was more for sort of senior people within an organisation. It gradually filtered down over time through the organisation. They became more available to lower levels of staff. Also very popular to have hospital applications. You would have things like a computer on wheels, where they'd have either a PC or a laptop that was transported around on a wheeled trolley to provide bedside access, as an alternative to trying to have Ethernet connections near patient beds. But these are all fairly specialised niche applications really that weren't widely available. The other thing about these devices as well, they were all very much subject to IT department policies and security mechanisms, so they were very tightly controlled, and access to them and the resources that they could actually access was very, very tightly controlled. But then we had the growth in mobile devices which started to appear in the marketplace, particularly things like the iPad and the iPhone, which became more and more available, and there was a greater and greater take-up of these devices. And initially these devices were very popular in the home. People used them on their home Wi-Fi networks, and they would use them on guest Wi-Fi networks when they were visiting other organisations. But as the convenience and the availability of these devices grew very, very quickly, there was suddenly pressure on IT staff within organisations to start actually providing the ability to use these devices, these consumer level devices, on corporate IT networks. And this was particularly driven by senior level staff who had iPads and iPhones, and they wanted to be able to use them in the same way that they did at home. They wanted to be able to use them on the corporate network. Unfortunately, when these first consumer-grade devices appeared, they didn't have sufficient security to be deployed onto many corporate networks, and this provided quite a headache for IT departments who were really struggling to try and accommodate these requests by senior level people within organisations to actually get these devices onto a corporate wireless LAN for them. And also the concept of accommodating a user's own device on a corporate network in any shape or form was very much an alien concept. As I said previously, all devices have been subject to very rigorous configuration and security controls, and also the devices have actually been supplied by the organisation themselves to be used on the network, and only devices supplied by an organisation were allowed to be attached to the wired or the wireless LAN. And suddenly there was this whole paradigm shift that kicked in when suddenly IT departments were under pressure to find some way of securely connecting users' own devices so that they could be used on the wireless LAN in the work environment. And this is where the whole concept of BYOD, bring your own device, kicked in. I'm pretty sure you would have heard of this before, but BYOD is a policy or a concept of allowing end users to bring in their devices to the workplace and use them for maybe guest access, or even for part of their job function. They can actually use applications or access websites internally within an organisation to actually do their day-to-day job, which was very much, as I say, a big mindset shift from the previous model of organisations providing all devices which have got to be connected to a network. So IT departments were under significant pressure to be able to support these consumer-grade devices, and this was things like the iPad, the iPhone, and obviously there were other things like the BlackBerry, and then all of the Samsung and Nokia devices came along. There was a whole host of smartphones, tablets that were suddenly popping out of the woodwork, and people were asking for them to be supported on the internal corporate network. And obviously because all of these devices were wireless, there was actually no way of providing any wired connections, so there was significant pressure to get them onto the corporate wireless LANs. So with this initial pressure coming from senior executive staff to provide support for these types of devices on a wireless network, this gradually filtered down through the ranks and got right down to the lowest levels of workers, and pretty much everybody was exerting pressure to be able to use these devices on the corporate network. There were some supposed advantages to this particular model. There was the efficiency gains that could be afforded by users being able to use devices that they were very familiar with and very comfortable to use on the corporate network, so that they would be able to perform their jobs more efficiently. There were also some supposed cost savings associated with it. Obviously an organisation wouldn't have any capital outlay for these devices because they're actually owned by end users, so that would mean lower capital expenditure for an organisation on hardware to be used on the corporate network. Unfortunately, there were some pretty big issues to contend with. It wasn't quite as straightforward as everybody would have liked. There were significant issues around security and the management of the devices, and also the applications for the various business processes that people wanted to use the devices for just might not exist. And so there was a requirement to provide some sort of either web-based internal portal, or maybe even the development of mobile apps to be able to enable people to be able to use their own devices for business functions. One of the biggest issues with the whole BYOD phenomenon is that of security. Obviously, as all devices used on a network previously had been provided by an organisation, then they were subject to pretty rigorous security procedures, and they had very tight controls and configurations on there. But unfortunately, with the BYOD phenomenon, users had their own device which they configured in their own way, and so security was very, very hard to enforce. Some of the security issues included who actually has access to the device. If the device is being used for corporate use, when it goes home, who has access to that device, what information might they be able to see? What about the actual security of the information on that device? If that device is actually subject to things like viruses, what happens to the information which may relate to the corporate environment which is maybe lost? Also, what about support of the device? Obviously the device needs to be secured in some way, but who's actually going to provide the support for that device if it's used for business purposes, and what mechanisms are going to be put in place? Is that going to be done by the end user? Is that actually going to be done by the organisation, and how's that actually going to be put into place? What about lost devices as well? If an end user takes a device home, leaves it on the bus or in a taxi or on a train, what about that device? How do we make sure that the device can be maybe remotely wiped, or the information is secured on it in such a way that it can't fall into the wrong hands? Another thing as well is who actually owns the data on that device. There's obviously going to be a mix of personal data on there, there's going to be corporate data on there. There's obviously the question about access to both types of data. Is an organisation going to have access to the personal data on the device, and vice versa in the home environment? Is everybody going to have access to the corporate data which is available from that device? And so over time, this explosion of BYOD devices just really took hold, and Wi-Fi access grew slowly from being very much a sort of complementary second-class access method within an organisation to start to become the primary and if not only access method in many cases, with far less reliance on wired switch ports, and the emphasis very much on wireless devices using corporate wireless network to access all types of information, provide all sorts of access to processes and applications within an organisation. So in response to the huge demands of BYOD, many organisations really had to scramble around to try and pull together some sort of BYOD policies to address things such as which types of devices could be used, security mechanisms which must be enforced. They also implemented management solutions to put some structure around the way employee devices were used on the network, and this could include things such as putting software applications onto devices which would provide secure storage for corporate information being stored on wireless devices, and also provide things like remote wipe capabilities in the event that devices were lost. Also, because of the significant rise in demands on wireless networks, many organisations also had to upgrade their existing wireless LAN capacity to be able to meet the significant increase in demands that BYOD placed on the wireless LAN infrastructures of many organisations. In addition to this as well, as people became more and more used to using wireless devices on their corporate network, we found that many more wireless enabled devices started to appear and needed to be connected to corporate networks. This included things such as Apple TV devices for screen sharing, Chromecast devices. We had games consoles appearing in some environments. We had a lot of specialist medical environments which were very popular in the healthcare environment, things like patient telemetry and monitoring systems. So there was this continuing explosion of BYOD devices for employees and additional devices which were required to be connected to corporate networks. And the expectations of a Wi-Fi networks grew wildly in a very short space of time. In the space of 2 or 3 years, we moved from some very basic requirements of a wireless LAN network of just providing things like web browsing and maybe some data transfer for a small number of users within an organisation, to providing full data, voice and video connectivity for the majority of employees or members of an organisation. This whole evolution of wireless LAN clients and the increasing requirements for capacity and access to wireless LAN networks is still going on at the moment. We've got another anticipated avalanche of new devices that are going to require Wi-Fi connectivity. You may have heard about the Internet of Things, often abbreviated to IoT, and this is going to be the connection of pretty much everything that we use in the workplace and at home into the internet, and many of these things are going to actually require a wireless connection. It's not necessarily going to be all devices connected over Wi-Fi connections. There are going to be other wireless technologies such as Bluetooth and Zigbee, which are both on the 2.4 gigahertz band, and there are also going to be other technologies such as cellular network, and also some old TV bands are being freed up to provide device-to-device type communications over wider areas. Also, I think that some IoT devices are going to be constrained by their power requirements. Many smaller devices are acting as things like sensors, may need to operate for many years on a single battery charge, and Wi-Fi technology is fairly power hungry in comparison to some of the other wireless technologies available, so that may limit its application. But there's no doubt about it, there is going to be significant ongoing increase in requirements for wireless LAN connectivity by this whole new avalanche of wireless LAN clients. In terms of the impact that's going to have on wireless LAN capacity, as I said previously, some devices may be connected using A2211 connectivity methods, but many others will use these alternative technologies. Either way, there are going to be significant ongoing demands on the spectrum that we already have. Many of these devices may be using Bluetooth or Zigbee. They're going to add even more to the already overburdened 2.4 gigahertz band, and as I say, whether or not those use those technologies or they use Wi-Fi connectivity, there's going to be more and more devices trying to use the same existing spectrum. So Wi-Fi is going to be impacted. There's going to be more and more challenges as we move ahead into the future with this whole explosion of devices which require some form of connectivity. So that pretty much wraps up our exploration of the evolution of clients. So hopefully you get some idea of how we've arrived where we are now, and some of the challenges that we're facing currently, and some of the near-term challenges that we're no doubt going to face with the IoT, the whole Internet of Things explosion. So just want to move on to a slightly different topic now. Just want to start looking at client behavior. One of the questions in your mind may be, what influences the behavior of a client? And we've got a series of questions that we'll have a look at, and then in the remainder of the topics we'll be exploring in this particular module, we'll try to answer some of these. So at the end of it, hopefully you'll have an understanding of why clients tend to behave the way they do. So some of the questions that I've listed, so I'm on to slide number 23 now, that you might like to take a look at. Which band will a client use? We've talked previously about the fact that some clients will support both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. Which band will a client use? They've obviously got a choice of two to use there. Also, which channel is a client going to use? Which AP is a client going to associate with? If it's got a number of APs to choose from, which one will it go for? And also, when and how will a client roam between access points? We've talked previously about the importance of clients roaming effectively so that they can maintain a high quality connection. And as I say, during the rest of this module we'll run through some other information which will help us to answer those particular questions. Also, another important part of understanding client behavior is understanding a little bit more about the A2211 standard itself. The A2211 standard, as we've previously discussed, provides a standard definition at layers 1 and 2 of the OSI model. At layer 1 we've got the PHY layer, which is the physical layer, and it describes things like the RF bands which are used, the modulation techniques, encoding techniques, things that are down at the physical RF layer. We've also got layer 2, which describes things which are up at the data link layer, and if you're familiar with Ethernet technology, no doubt you'll have heard about the data link layer previously and understand the types of information that's transported at the data link layer. So I just want to drill down a little bit more into layer 2, because this is the part that becomes interesting in trying to understand a little bit more about the behavior of wireless LAN clients. So if you think back to the Ethernet standard, the 802.3 standard, thinking at layer 2, we actually define one type of frame. It's a data frame, and its purpose is purely to transport a data payload. It actually transports as its payload layer 3 packets, which are generally IP packets, which are just sent back and forth between Ethernet stations on a point-to-point basis. So for 802.3 we've just got a single frame type which is just transporting data. In the 802.11 standard, because of the complexities of the connection methods that we've got there, then we have to actually have more than one type of frame at layer 2. In the 802.11 standard we've actually got 3 types of frame. We've got the standard data frame again that we had in 802.3, and again the payload of that is typically layer 3 packets, which is our IP traffic, but then we also have a management frame and a control frame, and each of these frame types provides a different function within the 802.11 standard to facilitate things like connectivity, as well as transporting data and providing access to the RF medium. So you may be wondering, why do we actually need these 3 frame types? And I'm just going to very briefly discuss that. We need to bear in mind that wireless LAN networks operate on an unbounded medium. That means it's open to the air. Anybody within the coverage area of a wireless access point can access that network if they have sufficient credentials and the right access method, and once they're on the network they can contend to use the airtime which is available within that cell. But we're talking about people over quite a wide physical area in different parts of a building, maybe, or different parts of a room, who can all access that. They're not constrained in the same way as something like an Ethernet port, where only one user can use that one port at any particular time. And because wireless LAN networks don't have that simple plug-in connectivity that you get with Ethernet networks, where it's simply a case of getting an Ethernet cable and putting it into a data socket to get connectivity, we have to have additional mechanisms that allow wireless LAN clients to be able to join a wireless LAN network. If we think of the Ethernet equivalent of mobility when moving between locations, the mobility which wireless LANs provide for us, then we can perhaps start to understand some of the challenges that we face with a wireless network. So if we think about an Ethernet network, if we enter a room, we can simply plug our Ethernet cable into a data port on the wall, and we've instantly got access to the Ethernet network. The medium is permanently free as the switch port is available. It's got no cable plugged into it, so we simply plug our Ethernet cable into a port and we have connectivity. As soon as we plug into that port, we've got full duplex, completely uncontended connection available to send data. There's no contention with any other stations on that same port. We've got exclusive use of that port. And then as we actually move from that room to another room, let's say if we have to move from one meeting room to another meeting room, it's simply a case of unplugging the Ethernet cable from the data socket on the wall, move to another room and plug it into the data port that's available in that particular room. So we've actually got very simple methods of access. We've got exclusive use of the medium, and if we start to think about how we actually facilitate that same sort of functionality and mechanism over a wireless network where we've got a contended environment, then we can start to think about the reasons why we might need to have additional frame types which provide the functionality that we need to try to emulate the simple plugging in and unplugging of Ethernet ports as we move from point to point, and to be able to provide access to our medium to be able to send data. So that pretty much wraps up our discussion of wireless clients for this particular episode. We'll actually be starting the next episode diving into the various 802.11 frame types, so we can explain some of the concepts that I was alluding to, how we can actually provide this mobile connectivity for our wireless clients. So just before I do a very brief summary of the topics we've covered in this particular episode, I just want to remind you, if you can, get along to my website, which is wififorbeginners.com. I'd be very keen for you to sign up to our newsletter. If you have a look on the right hand side of the website, on each page you can see a sign up form there to get the latest information about the podcast via our newsletter and about some of the exciting things we've got coming up in the future. Also, you can download all of the supporting materials, things such as the slides and all of the audio presentations that we've provided in the series so far. You can also find some quizzes there which can be very useful for testing your knowledge of the topics we've covered, and also access to a number of other very useful recommended resources that are going to help you with your wireless LAN studies. So just a very brief summary now of the topics we've covered in this particular episode. We started off by taking a very brief look at some of the Wi-Fi amendments that you may hear about, which are used to describe the capabilities of wireless LAN clients. We talked about 802.11b, which gives us connection speeds of up to 11 megabits per second, but it only applies to the 2.4 gigahertz band. We had 802.11a, which provides connection speeds up to 54 megabits per second, but only operates on 5 gigahertz. 802.11g, which again gives us 54 megabits per second, but this time only operates on the 2.4 gigahertz band. Then we had the 802.11n, which gives us a significant increase in speed, takes us up to 450 megabits per second, and is actually defined for use on both the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz band. And then finally we had the 822.11ac standard, which gives us connection speeds currently up to about 1.3 gigabits per second, but that's going to increase in the future, and this is only defined for use on the 5 gigahertz band. We also then went on to talk about the evolution of clients, how in the early days of Wi-Fi it was very much niche specialist devices that were used on wireless LAN networks, and these devices tended to be provided by an organisation subject to very strict security controls. But then as we experienced the growth in consumer grade wireless LAN devices, more and more organisations came under pressure to provide wireless access, particularly for senior management levels of an organisation. This led to the concept of BYOD, which is bring your own device, which enabled employees to bring in their own consumer grade wireless LAN devices to use on the corporate network, both for guest type access and to provide part of their day-to-day job role using applications and websites that enabled them to perform their job function. BYOD is supposed to have a number of advantages, including an improvement in efficiency because of users being familiar with their devices, and also cost savings because of the lack of capital outlay for the hardware for these devices that needs to be incurred by an organisation. However, we do face quite big issues with security and management of the devices, and also there may be instances whereby applications for particular business processes don't actually exist. There are some major security concerns around securing employee devices, things such as who has access to the device itself, what about the security of the information on the device, particularly corporate information, what about if users lose device, and there's a whole host of security considerations that need to be overcome. So as the proliferation of more and more wireless LAN clients grew and the acceptance of BYOD permeated through many organisations, Wi-Fi slowly grew from being a complementary access method to a network to become the primary, if not the only, access method in many organisations, with far less reliance on wired switch ports. This meant that many organisations had to put together some sort of BYOD policies and implement management solutions such as mobile device management solutions, and also to upgrade their wireless networks to cope with the increasing demands placed on wireless LAN networks. In addition to this, more and more wireless devices were added to the network as people became more comfortable with using wireless LANs as an access method to the network, and the expectations generally of Wi-Fi grew far beyond the original requirements of many wireless LAN networks, which was to provide a basic data service, typically providing a web browsing capability, into a fully fledged data, voice and video capable network. The growth in demand for wireless LAN services is only going to continue into the future. We've got the concept of the Internet of Things, in which many hardware devices are going to be connected via wireless connections to the Internet and to each other, and they will use a variety of connection mechanisms, including wireless LANs, but also other technologies such as Bluetooth and Zigbee. Cellular networks are also going to be part of the whole IoT picture. We took a very brief look at the A2211 standard again, discussing the layer 1 functionality, the file layer functionality that it defines, and also the layer 2 data link functionality that it defines. We also discussed the fact that in the A2211 standard, in contrast to the A22.3 Ethernet standard, where we have only one frame type at layer 2. At layer 2 in A22.11 we have 3 frame types, which are the data frame, management frame and a control frame, which enable us to provide the variety of additional functions that we need with a wireless LAN compared to an Ethernet environment. So I hope the information within this podcast has been of value to you. In our next episode we'll be continuing our discussion of wireless LAN clients, and we'll start by diving a little bit more deeply into the different frame types that we have within A22.11. So as I say, don't forget to get along to my website, which is wififorbeginners.com, to find out all of the supporting material for the podcast series, and I look forward to joining you again very soon on the next episode of the Wi-Fi for Beginners podcast.